speakers who will discuss innovative assessment and share stories of both challenges and success. Please join me to welcome our keynote speakers by giving a big round of applause. First of all, we have Dr. Catherine McClellan, the Director of Assessment and Psychometric Research, Australia Council for Educational Research. Next we have Dr. Rajentiran Selan, apologies if I mispronounce your name, Lead Assessment Specialist, Language and Culture, Singapore Examination and Assessment Board. Lastly, we have Professor Reiko Yamada, Dean and Professor of Faculty of Social Studies and Director of Center for Higher Education and Student Research at Dosisa University, Japan. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, so I was given the program schedule by the organizing committee. So we will have 2 hours discussion. Each speaker will deliver 30 minutes presentation, and the rest 30 minutes we will have a Q&A session, which is our discussion session. And the first presenter will be Dr. Catherine McClellan, yeah, I hope. But before going to her, I would like to take your time to share his bio, his short bio, which is actually quite long, but maybe I have to make it brief. So, Dr. Catherine is the Division Director, Assessment and Psychometric Research at the Australian Council for Educational Research. She has over 20 years of experience in education and assessment in a variety of research and operational roles, directing projects such as NAEP, the U.S. National Assessment of Educational Progress, Psychometrics, and the MET, Measures of Effective Teaching, Study Video Scoring. Dr. McClellan will present the paper entitled The Challenge of Assessing Process with Reliable and Valid Results. Dr. McClellan, the floor is yours.
Good morning. How are you today? Good. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this conference and give this presentation. I'm going to talk about some research and work that I've done over the last 20 years. My specialty as a psychometrician is in constructed response items. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why you might want to do them, why you might not want to do them, and things you should think about and pay attention to when you are, in fact, designing an assessment that uses constructed response items. Next slide, please. As mentioned in my bio, I work at the Australian Council for Education Research. Thank you. ACER is an organization founded in Melbourne, Australia in 1930, so next year will be our 90th anniversary. We are an independent, not-for-profit education research organization. We're just over 400 staff at the moment, and we have offices throughout Australia, as well as international offices in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the UAE, and the United Kingdom. We also have an ACER Foundation, which allows us to support projects that we believe are important to the education community. Next slide, please. So, when we talk about building assessments, we often talk about what types of items we're going to put on them. And as I said, I'm going to talk about constructed response items, but I'm actually going to start by talking about selected response items, because they are in fact the most common item type used in large-scale assessment. By selected response, I mean items such as multiple choice, choosing a hotspot, drag and drop, depending on the technology used, but the student is selecting a response from a set that are provided, so they're not creating a response. These items actually are the workhorses of our industry. They're very common, and they're common for good reasons. Selected response items can, if well developed, assess a range of skills, including some fairly high demand cognitive levels, but they do have to be well developed by people who know how to write effective items. They are relatively inexpensive to develop, and they're very fast and virtually free to score because they are machine scored. So computers doing the work. Computers are lovely workers. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never complain, and they never want a pay rise. So they are, in fact, great as items go. Most students at this point are quite familiar with the format of this type of item, so they don't need a great deal of familiarization in how to respond to them. They know to click or to fill in a bubble with a pencil. One of the advantages of this type of item is because the industry has had long experience with them, when you trial these items, they survive trialing at very high rates. By and large, students know how to respond to them. They assess the things they're intended to assess, so they're not lost during the trial period, which makes them financially attractive as well. They don't require huge samples to establish whether or not they're working. So when we do trial assessments with selected response items, we don't need thousands and thousands of cases to establish whether or not they're working. Usually a few hundred is sufficient. And you can give a lot of selected response items in a relatively short period of time. It's a rough rule of thumb in the industry that you allow about 1 minute per selected response item. So you can in fact give fairly long, pretty comprehensive, broad content coverage assessments that are in fact quite reliable for student assessments. So there are many attractive features to giving selected response items, which would logically lead to the question about why you do anything else. Next slide, please. When we talk about reliability, this is a question that comes up a great deal in assessment, and there are good reasons for it. Reliability, or at least one type, there are a lot of types, is the extent to which a test replicates itself. So if you could test a student an infinite number of times, and they learned nothing from that process, if the assessment is reliable, you should get effectively the same score every time. So we are getting replicable results from reliable tests. That's why we do it this way. If the test is not reliable, we're going to run into problems. If you're trying to do large-scale assessment, you care a great deal about confidence in the score of the candidate. You want people to believe that the assessment has in fact assessed the things that it was intended to assess. So if it's a maths test, you hope that it has in fact actually assessed the mathematics skills. But if it's not reliable, you're less sure that that's true. Scores will bounce around with resits if you have an unreliable assessment. So a student may do very well one time, very poorly the next. You want consistency, and that's what reliability grants us. If you have unreliable tests, it is hard to distinguish the high-performing candidates from the low-performing candidates. And that is, in many cases, the purpose of the assessment we're giving. So if you have an unreliable assessment, the main purpose of the assessment may in fact be faulty. The defensibility of using scores from unreliable tests is questionable. It may be questioned in the public media, in the press. It may be questioned in legal courts. I am originally from the United States, which is a famously litigious society. People in the US sue over everything, and tests are no exception. There are routinely lawsuits filed about the uses of test scores in the United States, and if the test is unreliable, courts will find against you, and that is not a pleasant experience, so we recommend against it. But one of the most important things about having a reliable test is that reliability serves as the upper bound on validity. Validity is the extent to which a test is measuring the thing we designed it to measure. But if the test is unreliable, it cannot be valid. You cannot draw a valid inference from results from an unreliable test. So we want to make certain that our tests, in fact, are highly reliable so that we can draw the inferences about the test scores that we care about. Next slide, please. So given all those wonderful properties of selected response items, why would you do anything else? Why would you do a constructed response item? Because you are going to sacrifice some things. But there are aspects of performance that it is believed are not well assessed by a selected response format. Generally what we're looking at in this case is, can the candidate actually do or perform some sort of skill? So usually these are items that are scored using a rubric. The student is given a task to complete. And the range of these is quite large. I was thinking about the Tokyo Olympics that are coming up. When the judges who are judging diving score those contestants, they're using a rubric that runs just over 200 pages. It is very, very detailed and very, very specific, so that they can in fact infer that the best diver has won the gold medal. But this turns up in assessment a lot of places. So you want to know, can the candidate dance, write, speak, draw, work in a team, complete a lab, write computer code, solve a problem, all sorts of active things, where your real question is, does the candidate have the skills that we believe they have? The other part of constructed response items that we use is to assess process. So you may have a selected response item with a fixed answer, but you also want to know, how did the student get there? How did they arrive at the conclusion that they gave you? So you also want to assess process and thinking. Can they tell you, this is the steps I followed, this is how I got to the conclusion, this is why I chose the answer I chose? But there are cases where the answer is not absolutely black and white and can be justified by a number of different paths. Constructed response items work well in that case. So that is another aspect of assessment. You can have, what can they do? Or how do they know what they know? So the CR items are thought of as assessing process as well as product. Selected response items tend to focus exclusively on product. They rarely tell you much about process. So there may be situations in which you actually want to use a constructed response item. Next slide, please. And there may be good reasons not to. Please click through. Right there, perfect. So I've marked 3 points on this data grid. This is actually a plot of Rater 1, the marker for a constructed response item across the horizontal, and a second marker on the vertical. They're marking the same set. This is a set of videos, in fact. So I have 2 raters, and it's a 6-level scale. So it starts at 1, goes up to 6. They can assign those scores. These raters had not been terribly well trained. It was part of a study. So what you want to see are the blue diamonds that I've circled in green. Those people agreed. So for that particular point, Rater 1 assigned a level 5, and Rater 2 assigned a level 5. They agreed with each other. They saw the same thing. That's what you'd like to have. You get some cases that are not quite as good. So down here in the orange circle, Rater 1 gave it a 2, Rater 2 gave it a 3. So they disagreed, but only by 1 level. So that is not a big disagreement. What you really don't want to see in data plots like this is the one I've marked with the red arrow up the top. So Rater 1 said this was a level 1 performance, the lowest level on the rubric, not very good at all. And the second rater said it's a level 6, highest possible level awarded on the rubric. So they saw the same video, and they apparently saw 2 completely different things. Because one of them said it's not very good, one of them said it's fabulous. This kind of disagreement is exactly what leads to accusations of subjectivity in constructed response scoring, and it's exactly what leads to unreliable tests. So when you don't do a really good job of training and monitoring your markers, you may in fact get scores like those red arrow marks, and that is dangerous to the use of the assessment. Next slide, please. So we think about this in terms of gold standards of performance. If you're giving a selected response test, we typically have more than 1 form, particularly if you're giving it at large scale. So the forms are designed to be parallel in difficulty and content, but that match is never perfect. It's never completely exact. Some forms are slightly harder, some are slightly easier. Content coverage is a little bit different because you can't get them to be perfectly parallel. So when you're dealing with a selected response test, it shouldn't matter to the examinee, the person who's taking the test, what form of the test he or she took. We make that happen by doing good test development, so our forms are in fact as parallel as we can actually make them, and we equate them. So we actually adjust away the differences in difficulty. So the forms, in terms of their scale score that's reported, are in fact comparable. The scores do mean the same thing. So we deal with this in analysis and psychometrics in order to achieve that gold standard. Doesn't matter to the candidate which form they take, it will all come out and be comparable in the final state. For the constructed response test, the standard is a little bit different, although it is parallel. For constructed response items, it needs to not matter to the person who took the test who marked it, who scored it, so which rater gave them the marks. The raters themselves should be comparable enough. The data they produce will also result in reliable, comparable outcomes. And we achieve that by good item and rubric development. That one's not different. High quality rater training makes a huge difference. If you do a good, thorough job of training the people who are doing the marking, they will produce reliable and comparable data. And if you don't, they won't. We also impose fairly stringent quality control measures to make sure that once we've trained them and they understand the rubric, that they stay consistent with the rubric throughout the marking period. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? That's a high standard. So some of the factors you have to address in dealing with these problems are listed here on the slide. Rater bias and rater influence, how you select raters, how you train them, the fact that they get tired. I said earlier, when you have a scanner scoring a selective response test or a computer doing hotspots, they don't get tired. They're happy to work 24 hours, 7 days a week. They never get exhausted. Human beings get tired. And when they get tired, it has an impact on their work. So you have to pay attention to rater fatigue. We do a lot of rater skills assessment as part of monitoring to evaluate things like fatigue when they're working. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some types and how we monitor scoring. And there is an important distinction to be made in terminology in terms of accuracy versus consistency. So I'll explain that a little bit. Next, please. So the first one is rater bias. I have never met or trained a marker who believes that he or she is biased. Every single marker that I have ever trained is in fact biased in some way. It is natural to human beings. We all are biased. We all have individual preferences. And it shows up in this work, sometimes in funny ways. So we do explicit bias training for the raters, where we talk about factors that might influence their judgment, things they might notice that annoy them, or that they really like, because bias runs in two directions. It is both a positive and a negative influence on the data. So training can be hindered in these spaces by social norms. It is difficult to talk about being biased, having innate judgments, being reflexive. And biases are triggered by all sorts of things that people find it uncomfortable to discuss. So you have to be careful in building the training and make the training a safe space where it's okay to admit that you're not perfect and you have personal preferences. And the need for bias training increases as there are more factors in play. So if you're scoring an essay, bias factors might include things like handwriting. There are visibly feminine traits, particularly to younger girls, in handwriting. So you can usually tell by handwriting if it's a girl or a boy. And there are people who prefer certain styles of writing. That is alleviated, obviously, if you have students type an exam, so you can no longer see their handwriting. So you can solve one bias problem by moving to an online assessment. But you can't solve all of them. So as you go to things like speech, where you can now hear inflection and pace and tone, and usually gender, those factors come into play more and more. And as you go into visual things like diving or dancing or public speaking, which we're going to be doing today, or teaching, now you can see both the person who is the candidate and the context in which they're working. And all of those factors come into play. So as you get more and more complex types of constructive response performances, you need to address those factors in the bias training. And the training is really intended to make raters aware that they have biases and that they might have causes they hadn't thought about. It is not expected that we'll be able to eliminate all personal bias. It's not possible, and we don't expect it to happen. What we're looking for is the ability to get raters to realize they're having some sort of emotional reaction to the content that they're looking at, and put that aside and focus on the rubric and focus on the performance. Automated scoring is an interesting solution to some of this problem, because everyone will say, well, the machines aren't biased. Actually, the machines are. because we train the machines on sets of human-scored responses so that they learn how to do the scoring. So when you go into automated scoring, the machines aren't biased until we teach them to be, but we do teach them to be quite quickly. While I was working at Educational Testing Service, we did a study where we were evaluating using machine scoring on TOEFL speaking. TOEFL speaking is given around the world to people who speak English as a second language from all sorts of language originations. They don't typically speak English as their first language, and it is scored by human beings. So we were looking at training an automated system on a set of marked responses from TOEFL speaking. And once we finished going through the training set, the machine was biased. Showed up in two places. Interestingly, the machine has, apparently the people have, a real preference for people who speak Arabic as their first language. I don't know why, but apparently American raters like the sound of people who originally speak Arabic, and so they tended to overscore those and give them higher scores than were really warranted by the actual content of the response. So that was interesting. And the machine replicated that perfectly. So the machine also really liked Arabic speakers. It did not, however, interestingly, much like Chinese language original speakers. And I talked to some of the raters because I was trying to understand why that would be. And it turns out that in Chinese, pronouns don't have a gender. So there's no he and she, him and her distinction in Chinese, and that's common in a lot of Asian languages. However, for American speakers of English, that is a very, very basic mistake to make when you're speaking English. Now, it doesn't typically block understanding. It's not actually a huge problem, but they overpunish it because they find it emotionally upsetting to hear someone make what they see as a very basic mistake. And again, we trained a machine to replicate that exact bias because the people have it, the machines will also have it. We did, in fact, add things to their training about pronoun errors and how minor they actually are as an effort to correct that problem because they were over-punishing a set of speakers who were actually better qualified than they had been seeing them as. One of the things that's nice about working at a big testing company is that we can disqualify raters from scoring somebody whose response they know personally. Personal bias enters into this very strongly. That is not always possible when you're working in, say, a school context. You can't always say, you can't score this because you know that candidate. While I worked at ETS, we typically employed around 50,000 raters, so we were able to find someone who didn't know the candidate to submit to score it. Next slide, please. The other thing about bias that's sort of interesting, we tend to treat it as a main effect. Statistically, we think about it as an overall impact. So you have an individual rater who is particularly severe and gives scores that are too low, or is particularly lenient and gives scores that are too high. But that actually is not particularly common if you've done a good job training raters. You don't see that very often. Although when you look at simulation studies, it's almost always the way they simulate the data. Is that this is a main effect. The rater is consistently too high, consistently too low, only uses the middle scores. They have this full pattern of a way in which the rater always scores everything. But raters don't actually do that. Human beings are not that consistent. People tend to react to something that I describe as an interaction effect much more clearly. So there's some particular thing they do or don't like about a response, like the Arabic speakers and the Chinese speakers in terms of accent and English, and they respond to only those cases inappropriately. So if you happen to be a speaker of Norwegian who's taking TOEFL, there's no bias for or against that particular language. But if you happen to be an Arabic speaker, you're getting extra credit. If you happen to be a Chinese speaker, you're getting demoted. And those things aren't fair, but they also aren't something somebody does on every single case. It's only when those cases that have the biasing factor that turn up that it starts to be an issue. One of the hard things about this as a psychometrician is if you have a main effect, we can fix that in equating. It's fairly straightforward. But if you have an interaction effect, you can't because it does not show up throughout the whole data set. So you have to pay close attention to what you think the biasing factors are and try to deal with them in training, not in analysis. Next slide, please. Rater influence was a concern. If you have, my personal nightmare since I work in constructive response scoring a great deal, is a marker who is both fast and inaccurate because they contribute a very large amount of very bad data to the pool. Those are the worst possible raters you can get. Fast and accurate is great. Fast and wrong is terrible. So we pay attention to how much of an individual set of responses we allow any single marker to respond to. This doesn't matter if you're not making comparisons outside of the set that the marker has made, but if you want to make broad comparisons, we have to control how much pool influence we allow raters to have. So we don't let raters score more than, say, 10% of the pool of responses. And we don't let raters touch candidates more than once. That sounds more personal than it is. All that means is if we have 6 responses, a rater's only allowed to score 1 from a particular candidate, and different raters will have to score the other 5. So we only let a rater touch a candidate 1 time. So if they have some sort of biased reaction to that candidate, it won't pollute the whole data set. And we do pairing of raters so that we pair everybody who's working to allow us to evaluate their consistency. We did find that scoring leadership tendencies can really be a threat to quality. I worked on a large-scale study in the UK where we had scoring leadership who, it turned out, were overly lenient. So the initial pool of markers started off a bit variable, but not biased. They were centered around 0 as they should have been. But by the end of the project, they had all been pulled by their scoring leadership up, so they were all too lenient as well, because the scoring leadership was giving feedback to the markers during the process and retraining them off the rubric and making them more lenient as time went on. So overall, the whole pool by the end of the project was polluted by raters who were too lenient, giving too high scores. So scoring leadership could be a problem if you don't control their biases as well. Next slide, please. So people ask me this question a lot. What makes a good rater? How do you pick them? My personal preference is we find somebody who's meticulous and very detailed, and somebody who's willing to be obedient to the rubric and not replace the rubric we're using with their personal judgment. So we need people who can, in fact, use the rubric and not insert their personal preferences into the work. So we choose them a lot of ways. Clients routinely set requirements in terms of level of education or content expertise or certification or university degrees, years of experience. There's a lot of criteria that clients require for this. And we've done fairly extensive study on those to see if they're predictive. The answer is no. We have yet to find a factor that makes a difference in predicting rater accuracy. So 25 years experience, no experience in the content, does not seem to affect outcomes. The only factor we've ever found that makes a difference is can they be trained and pass our quality standards. But their background seems to make no difference at all. And we found this across a variety of tests, scoring all sorts of things. So we haven't yet found what it is that predicts what makes a good rater. I don't really know, but I do know they're out there because we use a lot of them. Next slide, please. So when we train them, what do we train them on? I mentioned bias, which is obviously part of our training, but when we train them on content, we take great care that not only do we have a clear rubric with a great deal of explanatory language, we also give examples, because the examples make the content concrete and real for them. So you have a different experience just reading a rubric and seeing examples of a performance, so reading sample essays or watching sample videos to understand what the rubric really means. So for every level of every scale, we try to provide example cases. The more complex the scoring task, so if you're scoring something like video or diving or dancing or art, which is a very complex process, getting training right becomes more and more important because the cognitive demand on your raters is going up and up and up as you give them more complex things to do. So training becomes hugely important as the tasks become more complex in performance. And I will say, I have seen training go wrong, and when training goes wrong, it cannot be fixed in analysis. This is an unrecoverable error, and it is hugely important. But as psychometricians, we're rarely trained to talk about this aspect of the work. We see the data once it's come out of scoring. It's too late then. Go ahead. There are pieces of logistics in training. We routinely train thousands of people to do this kind of marking work. And so you have to think carefully about how are you going to make that happen. In every project I've ever worked on, the raters prefer to be trained face-to-face. They like the social aspect. They like seeing each other and spending time together, being able to discuss things face-to-face. We have typically done a great deal of our training online. It works just as well, if not marginally better, but the raters don't like it, and they will complain about it a lot. So we do find the online training has advantages in that it is perfectly consistent. If you're training several thousand people, you probably need several raters, so several trainers, and they will not be perfectly consistent. The training is always available, and people who don't have to travel can join your pool of raters, so you get more people to have access to it. Online training is expensive to build, but it's cheap to maintain, so you have to make an initial investment in getting it together. But once it's there, maintaining it is relatively inexpensive. Next slide, please. I told you earlier that raters get tired. This is one of the studies we did when we looked at it. These are TOEFL speaking raters. We were looking at whether they could work a 4-hour or 8-hour shift. So the blue and orange lines show the 8-hour shift, and the red and purple ones show the 6-hour shift. So they either started at 8 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning and worked until 4 in the afternoon. And we checked them throughout this period. The two long lines and the two short ones both have differences in that on the blue line, they scored the same response for 8 hours. It is an extremely tedious task to score TOEFL speaking on the same response for 8 hours. So in the orange, when we changed the response, they were scoring every 2 hours. The same thing's true in the red and purple. The purple line is where they changed every 2 hours and they worked for 6, and that got us pretty consistently our best results. You will notice by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they all looked tired. See the long tail off going down. So 6 hours is a long time to do a cognitively demanding scoring task. It is quite long. Next slide, please. We do a lot of skills assessment for the raters. Go ahead, please. We do both visible assessments and invisible assessments because it turns out, one more, that the raters actually respond differently to those. If they know they're being tested, they demonstrate signs of test anxiety like every student we've ever assessed. So they get nervous and they perform worse. So we have both visible types of assessments where they know they've passed or failed. We also hide things in their live scoring and they don't know they're being assessed, because what we really want to know is what is their typical performance. And their typical performance shows up in the invisible assessments. Next slide, please. So I will come to the end of this and talk about consistency. One more, please. People measure inter-rater agreement pretty regularly, and they have double scoring data, and they process it, and they tell you how often the raters agreed with each other. This is not my personal favorite measure, because consistent raters are actually uninformative. If they agree, okay, either they're both right or they're both wrong. You have no way of knowing which of those two things is the case. They can, in fact, agree and both give the wrong score. And if they're inconsistent, you may have one rater who's right and one who's wrong, which you don't know who's who, and there's no way to tell. Or they're both wrong. They can have given the thing a 2 and a 4, where the correct level is 3. So they've disagreed, and neither of them is correct. So consistency actually is not a terribly informative statistic. Next slide, please. What you actually want is accuracy. What you care about is, are they right? Did they give the correct score to the response they're looking at? So accurate raters will tell you that they're right. It does require that you have some pre-scored cases that you consider to be some standard of truth. That is not trivial to get. But one of the nice things about accurate raters is if they are accurate, they will also be consistent. If they all get the score correct, they will agree with each other as well. So if you measure accuracy, you get consistency measures also. They come in for free. Next slide, please. So here are my final thoughts on this. When you are doing this work, you want to eliminate all the extraneous factors from the work that you can. So rater bias and rater fatigue and training and all of the things that you do are aimed at eliminating extraneous variance from the system, so we improve reliability. That includes the variance due to human judgment, which people call subjectivity. We want to achieve comparability because it's the core of what we mean by standardizing assessment. Human beings are an interesting class to work with. They're much harder to train than machines. They complain a lot more. They are a lot more fun. And there are some human beings who simply cannot learn to do this work. They cannot put their personal preferences aside. They simply cannot learn to be standardized. I have run into a few of them in my life. It has been interesting, but I've never been successful in moving them. So there are some who just can't learn it, because scoring is actually a skill set that's distinct from other things. I have occasionally had to terminate a marker and had them be very upset and yell at me, "But I'm an excellent teacher." I'm sure you are, but that doesn't mean you're an excellent marker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McClellan, for the insightful presentation. You know, lifelong learning has been a buzzword for quite a long time, including in Indonesia. Yeah. And we are still underway to find the precise form or precise way to translate this lifelong learning into policy. But in Singapore, this concept has been translated into policy and assessment strategies, and our next speaker will share his thoughts and experience with this concept, with how to translate this lifelong learning into policy practice. But before we are going to our next speaker, I would like to share some of his short biography. So Dr. Rajentiran Selan is a lead specialist in Singapore Examinations and Assessment Board. He has 36 years of experience in assessment, curriculum development and instruction of English language and literature in English. He holds PhD in educational assessment from the University of South Australia in Adelaide, right? And he has strong leadership, administrative and communication skills. So, Dr. Selan, time is yours.
There is one thing that unites all of us in this room, no matter where we work, what our actual area of work is, what our specific duties are, we are all educators. And we are always working to benefit our students. So to all fellow educators, selamat pagi. Before I begin, I also want to say terima kasih to the Ministry of Education and Culture, and I'm saying this on behalf of the other keynote speakers as well, for giving us the opportunity to be present at this international conference and to share our professional lives as educators, including our own views on educational assessment. The topic of my presentation is expanding assessment practices in the policy context of greater teacher autonomy in Singapore. Next slide, please. First, let me give you an overview of the structure of Singapore's education system. As in Indonesia, our primary education lasts for 6 years, but we don't have junior high or senior high at secondary education. We have 4 years of secondary education, followed by post-secondary education. Now, post-secondary education, typically students will move on to junior colleges, but in recent years, more and more students have been going to polytechnics. Okay? Those who are vocationally inclined, they go on to institutes of technical education. Of course, there are other alternative qualifications such as IB, the International Baccalaureate, and some others. Now, at the end of every stage of schooling, you'll notice that there is a national examination. So at the end of primary education, we have primary school leaving examination. At the end of secondary education, we have two examinations at 2 levels. One is the GCE N level or normal level examination, and the GCO level or the ordinary level examination. And if students go on to junior colleges, then they will sit for GCA level examination. So that these examinations are, of course, they carry high stakes because they determine further educational progression and as well as job placement and also entry into many other fields. Okay. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a bit about the broad educational policy that is guiding us over the last 20 years. Okay. In 1997, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, announced this phrase, introduced this phrase, thinking schools, learning nation. This has been the overarching vision for our education system since then. Okay. Now, as I said, this was implemented in 1997, basically to strengthen thinking and inquiry amongst students. Curriculum content, the syllabus coverage, in other words, was cut down by 30%. Teacher training was enhanced. Schools were encouraged to share best ideas and practices. During the launch in 1997, the then Prime Minister, as I mentioned earlier, mentioned that it was critical to fire in students a passion for learning and to develop the creative thinking and learning skills required for the future. He also added that schools must be crucibles for questioning and search to forge this passion for learning. So that was the first phase. The second phase, we call it the teach less, learn more movement. Okay? It was launched to strengthen teachers' pedagogies. The aim was to help teachers better engage students and develop their critical faculties through real-life learning experiences. Curriculum was cut down further by 20% so that there is more time and space for more active and independent learning. Only last year, the third phase, Learn for Life, was launched to prepare students for lifelong learning in an uncertain, fluid future. It is important to remember that these three phases of educational reform, they are not meant to be distinct. They actually build on one another. They are all moving towards the same vision, and that's why I labeled the slide title as Three Phases in Alignment. Okay. But the framing for each phase is slightly different. The first phase, Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, is framed from the national or systems perspective. The second phase, Teach Less, Learn More, is framed from the teacher's perspective. And the current phase, Learn for Life, is framed from the student's perspective. They are united in that they all aim to move the education system forward in the same direction. Next slide, please. I will now provide more details on the third and current phase, Learn for Life. Now, in this phase, it is not to say that exams are going to disappear. The exams, the national exams, continue to be retained. Okay? But what is changing in a very visible, important way is that we are trying to de-emphasize the influence of national examinations, especially in the years where students don't have to prepare for these examinations. Okay? So, again, just to reiterate, the idea is that there's nothing wrong with having examinations and class tests, but we need to make changes to them to have them in suitable quantities. So, the government has just recently announced that there should be only one class test per subject per term that can be counted towards the year-end score, what we call the weighted assessments. Formative tests such as worksheets, classwork and homework to gauge learning outcomes and the strengths of each child, these are fine, as they are not high-stakes tests that result in substantial loss of curriculum time. Because I think it has been very well documented that examinations in many systems, they have a negative washback effect. Okay? And often that comes in the form of curriculum narrowing, meaning that there are important learning outcomes, but we tend to de-emphasize them in the curriculum we enact, because these are not assessed at the national examinations. Because we have to remember that national examinations are often timed examinations, and they cater to the entire nation by definition. So there are constraints on what can be assessed, during these examinations. Okay. Oh, going back to the current phase. So there are very visible changes in the assessment system. This time around, very specific directions that are going out to schools. So at primary 1 and 2, the first 2 years of schooling, schools will no longer have any weighted assessments or examinations, and no assessment will count towards an overall score. Okay? So first 2 years of schooling, no weighted assessments, no exams. Okay? Then at the other levels, like primary 3, primary 5, secondary 1, secondary 3, the mid-year examinations have been scrapped. There will be no more mid-year examinations. Why? This is to allow students to build confidence, develop an intrinsic motivation to learn, and to adapt to the new demands at each transition stage. And I think the directive has also gone out that class tests need not always look like mini examinations taken under simulated exam-like conditions. So what do these changes add up to? Well, it will free up about 3 weeks of curriculum time every 2 years, and this can be used to better pace teaching and learning, such as applied and inquiry-based learning, inquiry-based pedagogies. In addition, teachers have now got a strong impetus to reconsider the assessment objectives and assessment tasks to derive maximum benefit for their students' learning. So you can see over the 3 years, things are taking very firmer and firmer shape. And more concrete directions have been given to schools. Next slide, please. So there are four main directions for school-based assessment which have been identified. Okay. The first is that assessment is an integral part of learning and supports students' holistic development. Secondly, there is a balance of assessment for learning, there's a balance of assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Thirdly, assessment information is used to scope future teaching practices. Lastly, learners are involved in their own assessment so that they become self-directed learners. Next slide, please. When we reflect on the three recent phases of educational reforms at Singapore, it becomes clear that the changes in educational reforms over the last 2 decades in Singapore are geared towards facilitating greater teacher autonomy. I think you can see the gradual shift, right? I mean, although initially it was framed in terms of the system's perspective, then the teacher's perspective, then the learner's perspective, it is quite clear that they are all moving in the direction of giving teachers greater autonomy. Now, this we must understand, Singapore has always had a very centralized system in terms of curriculum as well as in examinations. So this is a big change for us. Okay? At the same time, what these changes reflect is that you need to have a supportive policy context in order for change to happen. Okay? So a supportive policy context is critical to facilitate education change. Next slide, please. So, when we give teachers greater autonomy, teacher-based assessment becomes more prominent in focus. So, what is teacher-based assessment? Now, here I'm going to repeat the ideas of Davison and Leung, 2009. Okay. 3 important things to take note in teacher-based assessment. Firstly, it invokes a more teacher-mediated, context-based, classroom-embedded assessment practice. Second, it considers not only who is doing the assessing, but also has implications for the what, where, how, and most importantly, the why of assessment. Thirdly, both the agency of teachers and their educational contexts become important. So seen in this light, teachers are not just instruments of assessment. They become agents of assessment. And as I mentioned earlier, it is well documented in research that classroom teachers follow closely the practices of national examinations so closely that it results in curriculum narrowing. Okay? And I also explained earlier that what curriculum narrowing means is that some educational outcomes which are in the planned curriculum but not assessed in high-stakes timed examinations are given insufficient importance in the enacted curriculum. Now, this unfortunate washback of examinations has also been noted by researchers in Indonesia. For instance, in the last ICEAP conference, which was held last year, Ulumuri, Lisamayanti, Vijayanti, and Fujianita noted that teachers in Indonesia utilize daily classroom assessments mostly for assessment of learning rather than to enhance learning. They identified one main cause of this, which is teachers do not know how to use assessment for learning effectively. In another research paper, two other Indonesian researchers, Effendi and Suyidi, 2017, wrote about the negative washback impacts of the nationwide English national examinations in Indonesia. They highlighted that the solely multiple choice format of these examinations did not provide sufficient evidence of test takers' actual language ability. This is a point made by Dr. McClellan just a few minutes ago. In addition, they noted that teachers and students spent a lot of time on repetitive exercises, but that this time and effort did not in fact develop the students' language ability. Students were more often than not trained in examination strategies rather than acquiring and developing the knowledge and skills to be communicatively competent in the target language. They stressed that exam strategies therefore did not necessarily equate with successful learning. An important aspect of teacher assessment literacy, therefore, is that teachers should play a larger role in providing more varied and complex learning to their students based on their curriculum and their own local contexts. Teachers should not be limited by the formats, constructs, and processes of national examinations in planning and implementing school-based assessments. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows, sort of, just gives you an idea of a research project that I did, which I completed in 2012. Actually, it was my doctoral research project. Okay, and the research question was, how do teachers interpret and manage English language assessment practices in the context of the policy innovation of the integrated programs in Singapore? Just a few words about the integrated programs. Now, if you recall my earlier slide, one of my earlier slides, I said at the end of secondary education, we have the GCO level national examination. Now, for this integrated program, for students in the integrated programs, they were exempted from the O-level national examinations, and they were offered guaranteed admission to junior college. Okay, so they were a special group. Okay, and my research interest was to go there and see, okay, this is the intent, there is a supportive policy context, but how do teachers actually interpret and manage their practices? Okay, now I'm not going to describe my study here at length because that's not the main focus, but what I would like to do is to distill my findings into some recommendations, okay, which you may want to apply to your own discipline. Okay, and these directions reflect the measures or the strategies that teachers have taken, teachers in the research project have taken to expand their assessment practices when they have more autonomy and a supportive policy context. Next slide, please. Okay, you may ask, the integrated programs obviously caters to a special group of students. How valid are these findings? But actually, if you want to study change, you have to go into an environment and look at things where change is possible. Okay, so the integrated programs is the justification is not just about finding more about the integrated programs. It is, you treat it like an assessment test tube. It's a test tube, okay, to find out, well, if teachers are given more autonomy, what are the directions in which they move to expand their practices? Okay, so it is an assessment test tube. Okay, so that now I'll come to the findings. Okay, now the first finding is teachers reframe their roles. I'll talk about it in detail a bit later. Second finding is teachers expand their assessment constructs. Now, just to recap, construct, what do you mean by construct? An assessment construct means what is being assessed. Is it language ability? Is it problem solving? Is it mathematical ability? So construct is what is assessed. So teachers expand assessment constructs. Third finding, teachers increase the range of elicitation and judging procedures. Now I'll look at each of these findings in a little bit more detail. Okay, next slide please. Okay, how do teachers reframe their roles? First of all, they revision their learners in the schools, meaning that they see them, obviously preparing students for an examination is important, but they ask themselves, what do we see our learners doing after they finish this stage of schooling? What is important? What should we do to make these things happen? Okay, so in other words, how are we equipping them for their life ahead? Secondly, they adopt the roles of assessment developers in their schools and work as a school-based assessment community. Now, why would I consider this reframing? Because if you go back to my earlier statement, we are used to working in a centralized system, highly centralized system, so we tend to take all the cues from there. But here, they are exercising more autonomy and discussing things as a department, as a school, and sometimes even as a school cluster to see how to forge ahead. Okay? And lastly, that's already obvious, they engage in professional development, so they attend conferences such as this, they share best practices, and then sometimes even they even work with consultants, okay, based on the specific needs. Okay? And of course, we cannot rule out reflection, okay? They continually reflect on their practices, whether individually or collectively, they do that, and in fact, there is space in their workload to accommodate that, to give a bit more time for reflection. Next slide, please. Okay, teachers expand assessment constructs. Now, just to recap, my study was focused on English language teachers, okay? But of course, how they actually do this is specific to language. It could apply to Bahasa Indonesia as well, or any other language. But if you're a maths teacher or a science teacher, I think you take the main points. The fact that you can expand your assessment construct in your field, but in different ways. Okay, now, if you look at the circle right at the bottom, okay, this is quite a common way of looking at language and a limited way of looking at language. And this actually is has been noted as the Buckman and Palmer model, 1996 model, where language is seen as a systematic code, as a systematic code, and language ability consists of language knowledge and metacognitive strategies. But this limited view does not reflect the growing consensus in the field that language use is a social practice. Okay, so just to forge ahead, they pay attention. How do they expand? One way is to pay greater attention to culture. And how do they do this? By incorporating literary texts into the curriculum, okay, and allowing students to make connections with their own real world. Secondly, they pay more attention to content. So, for example, in writing expository essays, okay, they do not always ask them to write under time conditions. They are given space and time outside curriculum time to research, to go to the content in depth, you know, and that is something to be seen as desirable. That's something that's seen as part of their growth. And then on the leftmost circle, there's stronger emphasis on higher order thinking, learning, and communication skills. So, for example, when we are assessing in an oral examination, we usually test for pronunciation, fluency, all right, matters like this. But they started looking into things like body language, eye contact, confidence, okay? So language as a social practice. Higher order thinking could be things like more inferential questions, critical thinking skills, you know, and so on, okay? Okay, the last finding, next slide please. Teachers increase the range of elicitation and judging procedures, okay? Now, as I said, traditionally, they have adopted procedures related to national examinations, okay? Now, they've started to make changes. So, before, the mid-year exam, the continual assessments, all the weighted assessments just resemble a mini national examination. So, now, they adopt different kinds of framework. So how the assessments add up, this is all decided by the school. So not just taking the cue from the national exams. Then they introduce new assessment tasks and modify assessment tasks. Okay, so in order to assess the expanded assessment constructs, they develop new tasks like, for example, getting students to read and then to do summaries of those readings. Okay? So, and this has an advantage because it allows students to follow their own interests. At the same time, you know, it is very developmental in nature. Okay? Third bullet, changing assessment criteria and using assessment criteria flexibly. If you think about marking standardized examinations, okay? The idea is to give a grade and to be as consistent as possible, as how Dr. McClellan explained earlier. But is that the only framework, is that the best framework to use when we want to enhance learning? So in order to give feedback, do we need more detailed rubrics? Okay? Should we change the criteria, or should we elaborate more on the criteria? So these are things for teachers to consider. Allowing students to take more responsibility for their assessments. These include things like peer assessment and self-assessment, which includes reflections as well. Okay? Now, that brings me to my last slide. Okay? Next slide, please. I'll just wrap it up. Okay? Now, the Latin root word for assessment is assidia, which means to sit beside the learner and support his or her learning. Okay? The reframing of specialist roles, the expansion of assessment constructs, and the increase in the range of elicitation and judging procedures have one goal in common, and that is to enhance students' learning. Through the use of alternative conceptualizations and processes, teachers find ways to get to the essence of their locally planned curriculum and use assessment to enhance students' broader learning. So, assessment for learning therefore requires a conceptual, constructivist, and collaborative approach. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Selan, for the wonderful presentation. Next, we have another presenter from Japan. As you know, Japan has always been a living example of diligent, innovative, modern but culturally deep-rooted nation. Today, we will hear another presentation from Professor Reiko Yamada, will present the paper entitled Assessing Learning Outcomes of Undergraduate Students in Japan, Integration of Direct and Indirect Assessment. But before that, allow me to take a brief of your time to share his short bio. Her short bio. Professor Yamada is a professor of Faculty of Social Studies and director of Center for Higher Education and Student Research at Doshisha University of Kyoto, Japan. She received MA and PhD from University of California, Los Angeles, School of Education, Social Sciences, and Comparative Education. Professor Yamada, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for kind introduction of me, and it is my great pleasure to participate in the second international conference here. And I am the higher education research specialist, and today I want to focus on the level of higher educations, how to integrate the indirect assessment with the direct assessment to measure the learning outcome of undergraduate student. Next slide, please. And I'd like to show you the background of the study. First of all, higher education students are expected to develop 21st century generic and disciplinary skills. And these skills include the critical thinking, problem solving, and other communication skills or teamwork skills. For dealing with these challenges, to be engaged, globally oriented citizens and ensure lifelong learning becomes very important. And in Japan, recently the to measure the learning outcomes becomes a national debate or national agenda for all the universities. And in 2015, the new laws were enforced. That is, each university is obliged to make clear the three policies: admission policies, curriculum policies, and diploma policies. Next slide, please. So, in the worldwide, there is a growing demand for objective, reliable, and valid assessment for this purpose. This is mentioned by the Richard Shabuson in 2018. And here the question arises whether there is any correlation between subjective and objective assessment of student learning outcomes. And higher education institutions in the world are required to demonstrate learning outcomes regardless of academic disciplines. Next slide, please. So The purposes of the study I will show you today is, the first one is to investigate whether or not the result of direct assessment correlate with the result of indirect assessment. In this sense, an indirect assessment means a self-reported student survey. In concrete, is there, secondary, in concrete, is there any relationship between objective measure of academic achievement and student self-reported achievement? And thirdly, to investigate whether or not the result of direct assessment correlate with time spent for independent study outside the class. This is a specific agenda for Japanese university students. Japanese university students all the times criticize that their learning time is very short compared with other countries like the United States and sometimes East Asian university students like China and Korea. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is too much, so please look at the previous studies of research on indirect and direct assessment. There are a lot of accumulation of the previous studies on the indirect and direct assessment. And sometimes the people who support the direct assessment are criticizing the result of the indirect assessment. Indirect assessment result is not correlated with the result of the learning outcome measured by the direct assessment. The next slide, please. And for example, let me show you one of the characteristics of previous researches. Among the various means of directly assessing learning outcomes, researchers and experts in the United States have been actively engaged in developing diverse and cutting-edge standardized tests in the higher education level. So there are a lot of standardized tests in the United States to measure the outcomes of general education and also the disciplinary outcomes. The majority of standardized tests in the United States have been developed with the goal of assessing learning outcomes for general education, as I said before, writing ability and critical thinking skills. So, for example, the CLA is a newly developed in the United States to measure the critical thinking or kind of writing ability, not only the marking score, but more objective kind of test. Next slide, please. But here is never-ending discussion. For example, which is better, direct assessment or indirect assessment, or integration of both assessment? It is a never-ending discussion in the world. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So, in these studies, we wanted to integrate the indirect assessment with the direct assessment in one survey. So the goal of the research is to integrate direct and indirect assessment. In Japan, there has been the little research related to the development of standardized tests to assess the learning outcomes of general education. And little progress has been made in the development of such tests. It is in the context that we have endeavored to develop an objective test combined with context that we have endeavored to develop an objective test compared with student self-evaluations to assess learning outcomes for Japanese general education. So that we integrated two sets of the direct assessment and indirect assessment in the one questionnaire service. Next slide, please. And first of all, let me show you to develop the indirect assessment. we developed the questionnaire titled the Japanese College Student Learning Survey, JCSL 2013, comprising 92 questions in 7 categories regarding student experiences in various classes and with various teaching methods at the university. Learning experiences, weekly time use, and self-evaluations of current competences in 19 skill areas compared to the item of entry into the universities. So we tested the questionnaire at the university between December 2013 and 14. Of the 295 respondents, we got more than 200 students were the first-year students. Next slide, please. And about the objective test, we developed the objective quizzes in 4 categories: English comprehension, Japanese comprehension, current international topics, and logical reasonings. And pilot survey at the institution with 19 students in 2014, and revision of questions item to assess targeted ability. Next slide, please. And design of the survey, we'd like to show you. It includes the demographic questions, 5 items, and items for indirect assessment, 101 in 14 categories. Items for direct assessment quizzes, 12 in 4 categories, and 7 pages in total. Estimated time to answer, 25 minutes, a little bit longer. And maximum time for students from the pilot study, we say that they take the 30 minutes. So next slide, please. And this is a sample of standardized tests. It is in the category of logical reasoning. When top 2 are balanced, which one out of A through E makes the third one balanced? Next, please. And 57.8% of students gave correct answer. And next slide, please. This is a sample of opted out test, English or logical reasoning. This was opted out after the pilot survey in order to develop a survey that assesses the target ability with certainty, because this is not accurately measured, cannot accurately measure what categories, so we opt out. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And about this, our research project, we set up the research questions too. First one is there a correlation between student confidence and the objective academic ability based on the scores of the quiz type questions? And second one, is there a correlation between time spent studying and the result of the scores of the quiz type questions? Those are the very important research questions by our team. And next slide, please. And let me show you the overview of the survey responses. There were a total of 533 respondents from the 5 universities. Of the respondents, 320, 60% were male, 197, 37% were female, and 3% did not provide a gender. 203, 38.1% were first-year students. 208, 39% were second-year students. 68, 12.8% were third-year students. And 42, 7.9% were fourth-year students. And Japanese university is consisted of the 4-year programs, but 1.3% were fifth or higher year students. They could not graduate in the 4 years. And 5 did not provide this year. And this survey or indirect and direct assessment were provided to all the students, including the international students. But only the 1.3% international students responded to this survey. So probably this survey is written in Japanese and it is not applicable for international students. We are thinking about that. And next slide, please. This is the student confidence level in English ability. For example, level 1, I can understand well-known names, words, and simple sentences used in exhibit, posters, and categories. Level 2, I can understand short, simple sentences and short, simple personal communications. Level 3, I can understand everyday language and passages in subject areas with which I am familiar. 4, I can read articles and reports related to the news or current affairs. Level 5, I can read complex sentences. I can understand articles that are not in my area of specialty. And level 6, I can easily read passages of all styles, including those with abstract and complex sentences. This framework, we use the CEFAL. Have you ever heard of the CEFAL? European framework of the language framework. So this kind of level is consistent with the CEFAL. And the higher a student confidence in English ability is, the higher the scores on the quiz is. This is a result, just I can say that. Please, next slide, please. Next. And this is the one that I can say that the questionnaire included rubric type questions noted after the common European framework of different language to measure the students' self-evaluation of their English language ability and skills at the time of the survey. And as I said before, the student self-evaluation regarding English as shown. The higher a student confidence in English is, the higher the scores on the quiz is. This is a little bit consistent with self-reported confidence with the result of the direct assessment. And next slide, please. And this slide shows the relationship between self-evaluation of knowledge acquisition and objective ability. The higher the result is, the higher the student self-evaluation regarding improved understanding of global issues after entering university is, the greater the scores on the current affairs question is. But now, it should be noted that the percentage of correct answers declined slightly for students who responded that their understanding of global issues improved substantially. Because probably this is a kind of rating of something like of the rating misunderstanding occurs. Thank you. The next slide, please. And this is the relationship between GPA and numbers of correct answers of object quizzes. Examining the number of correct answers on the English questions and logic questions for students with higher GPAs and students with lower GPAs, we find that students with higher GPAs tend to have greater numbers of correct answers on the both objective questions than students with lower GPAs. From this, it appears that the number of correct answers on the objective test questions is correlated to some degree to GPA as a direct measure of learning outcomes. And this type of the analysis is usually done by the IL people, institutional research people, because they can trace the student from the first year student to the fourth year student by their names and kind of IDs. So recently in Japan, after the three policies were obliged to make clear in each university by the law, every university put more emphasis on the function of the institution research at the university. And before that, we just say that we could not trace the ID of the student because student ID is very sensitive one. But now, most of the IL people trace from the at the time of the admission to the graduation. So how they can grow substantially, or how many students are not good at growing cognitively or kind of in mental kind of things. Next slide, please. This is a special one, and when I show this kind of slide to the international conference, I got a lot of questions from the Asian countries that because time spent for studying is not a problem in many countries, but in Japan, many students study too much before entering the universities. But after entering the university, most of them do not study so much. And we can say that we looked at the relationship between student time and spent studying in or outside classes and the result of object quiz questions, but no correlation was observed. Next slide, please. And this is a relationship between confidence in gaining generic skills and scores in logical quizzes. We found that students with higher confidence in gaining of analytical and problem-solving skills tend to get higher scores on logical quizzes. And next slide, please. So, insight gained from the survey result. We can say that our analysis of the result of the questionnaire survey combining direct and indirect assessment that was developed by our team show that first, student confidence level in their English ability was correlated to a certain degree with the number of correct answers on the English questions in the objective test. And second, Student perception of their ability or inability are largely accurate. This second, the second findings is very important because in Japanese universities, many faculty do not trust the answers of self-reported answers of the student. They said, so the faculty development becomes very important, but many, still the many faculties are not doing positively for the faculty development. They said that the student answers are not reliable, but our studies show that student answers are very reliable. And next slide, please. And about the future challenges, we can say that we have a lot of challenges to develop object quizzes capable of assessing the general knowledge and skills, to make large number of objective quizzes for test item bank, to develop a comparative assessment which can be used in East Asia countries. Currently, because in East Asian countries, university students similar in teaching and learning at undergraduate and secondary education. And to do a comparative research in both Asia and other countries. Those are the challenges we face. Next slide, please. And then, what is going on right now? We developed a German-Japanese collaborative project, and this was conducted to investigate the similarities and differences between the two countries when modeling and assessing 21st century disciplinary and generic skills as key student learning outcomes. And we developed the kind of standardized test for economics, because economics among the social science field have more similarities worldwide. So it is easy to make the standardized test for economics disciplines. But it is difficult for other areas like philosophy, literature, and sociology, and education, especially education for teachers. This reflects the local standards and local cultures. And next slide, please. This is an example of comparative study in Germany and Japan. Most use information or preparation study the examination. A little bit different. Please look at this kind of things for your reference. And the next slide, please. And those are the references. If you wanted to look at those papers, please look at this slide and next slide, please. Those are the kind of the differences for your future researches. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yamada, for the wonderful presentation. And now we've come to the Q&A session, and we have another 30 minutes. And before that, I would like to invite our speakers to join me on stage, please. So, if anyone has any questions, so I'm not sure whether we open for 2 rounds or just 1 round. For the time being, maybe just 1 round first, for 3 questions from the floor. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, mention your name, your institutional affiliation, and straightforward with the question, and the speaker, you address the question. So 1 from that side, 1, 2, another one, please. Right or left? Right side. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Okay. First, do we have a microphone?
Thank you very much. My name is Yuna. I'm from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and I'm going to address my question to Dr. McClellan. Okay, it's very interesting presentation, and then in your presentation you mentioned that to avoid bias, it is better that the rater does not know the students or even have very little knowledge about the students they're being assessed. And then are you suggesting that the recent education now, the development in education now, will require the birth of another profession, that is a rater, who will work along with the teacher, or even you going to recommend that teacher also should develop a rating ability so that they can be not only an excellent teacher but also an excellent rater? Thank you very much.
Maybe we can collect the question first, and then okay. The second one who will.
Terima kasih. Saya Ujang Sukandi dari Tanoto Foundation. Saya tujukan kepada penyaji kedua. Di salah satu slide Anda menjelaskan bahwa di Singapura bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia atau bahasa Inggris? Oke. Jadi di salah satu slide Anda dijelaskan bahwa di Singapura ada era di mana mengurangi pengaruh national exam. Kemudian lebih pada otonomi guru ya dalam penilaian. Pertanyaannya adalah bagaimana Anda yakin atau meyakini bahwa hasil penilaian guru itu cukup reliable, tepat, dan sebagainya? Bagaimana Anda bisa yakin itu dan akurat? Ya. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Eviana from Puspendik. I am interested to presentation from the Catherine. Based on your presentation, I get information that we assume constructed response is better than multiple choice. I get it. But it have a potentially problem. That is the rater bias. You have explained to us how to minimize the problem. And now I want to know how it implement for the student. Which level of student recommended use the constructed response item? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions here from Ibu Yuna. Oh yeah, from Ibu Yuna and from Pak Sukandi and from Pak Evi. 2 questions for Dr. McClellan and 1 question for Dr. Selan from Singapore. For Dr. Selan, so maybe I just translate the question. So there is an era that there is a shift from national exam to teacher autonomy that give the liberty or autonomy for teacher to do the assessment. So how can you make sure that the teacher assessment are reliable, valid, yeah, and something like that. Okay, so maybe first Dr. McClellan to address the question. Thank you.
I'll start with your question. Thank you for asking. I think that this is an answer which is context specific. So in many classrooms, the teacher scores all of the student work. And that's fine, because even if a teacher has particular biases, they apply to all the students equally. So effectively, it's a constant penalty, or it's a constant addition for all the students in the context. So as long as the inferences you're making, based on the work that you've graded, are consistent within your classroom, and that's the only context you want to make inferences in, it's perfectly fine for teachers to grade their own work. The question arises around rater bias when you want to draw inferences outside those classroom walls. So you want to compare to other teachers' classes, or other schools, or national context. In those cases, the individual biases of the raters start to damage the quality of the data. So I think this is a case where you need to make a judgment about the purpose of the assessment and the purpose of the scoring, and decide whether or not it's worth the investment in standardizing the scoring as well as the assessment. Because standardizing scoring and using human beings is expensive, it takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, it takes training, so it's an investment. And this is a decision, as always, when limited resources apply, do you need to do it this way? And the answer is not always, but is sometimes. So I think the stakes of the assessment and the comparisons you want to make determine whether or not you need to invest in standardized scoring. Thank you for the question. I have seen constructed response items used with students who are very young. So we have an assessment that we give in Scotland, which is given to what they call their P1. Those students are 5 years old. It is largely selected responses, but students that age are capable, particularly if enabled with technology, to do constructed response items. It depends on what you're asking. So, as is always the case, as we said earlier, when you are dealing with limited resources, so time, money, effort, students, all the things that go into doing large-scale assessment, you have to make a decision about whether the construct you want to assess can be best assessed or only can be assessed using a constructed response item. There are a lot of cases in which that's just not necessary. You don't need to expend the resources and the time and the effort to do a constructed response item, but you can do them with very young children all the way up, obviously, to adults who take constructed response tests all the time. If you have a driving license, you took a CR test. Somebody judged whether or not you could drive. Adults take them all the time without noticing. Children usually notice because they're embedded in their schooling. But this is a decision you need to make based on the construct you want to assess and the ways in which you want to assess it. If a selected response item will do, I would always prefer that you use one because they're easier, faster, cheaper, and in many cases better. But there are types of constructs and processes that really require that you build a performance assessment and all the scoring burden to some extent that goes with it in terms of time and money and effort and schedule. So you can use them at any age, but I always recommend you use them sparingly and use them wisely.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Dr. Selan?
I believe the question was something like this. How do we ensure that there is validity and reliability in teacher-based assessment practices? Actually, my answer will echo somewhat what Dr. McClellan said. Now, I think first and foremost, we have to be clear about the purpose of the assessment. When high stakes are involved, okay, and we need to be fair across a very large cohort, across many different schools, many different provinces, the need for this high level of reliability and standardization is much greater, of course, okay? But when it comes to school-based assessment, remember the first finding that I cited was you need a change in mindset. It's what benefits the child through this assessment? That is the question you're asking. Okay? So, it does not mean that we throw reliability out of the window. No. but it is not exercised perhaps to the same extent. Let me give you an example. In the schools that I studied for my project, what happened was that the teachers in that teaching that level, that department, they will get together and talk about what needs to be assessed, what kind of standards they expect, what kind of tweaks they need to make to the mark scheme. They will decide, okay, and they will go ahead with it. So the important question to ask at the end of the day, is it benefiting the students? Yes. Of course, the higher the stakes are, the emphasis on reliability gets, higher and higher. But in school-based assessments, in everything we assess, is that the case? We want to see the child, the child's eyes light up when they're pursuing a particular question. There's a certain delight in following, doing a certain task. All these have immeasurable benefits. So I'm really back to the point of be clear about the purpose of the assessment. And I know in many systems, and it's very well documented, that teachers just take the cues always from the national exams. But I'm saying we have to wear a different lens now, and when we prioritize learning, especially in a school-based situation, then we can do it collectively. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight. I think a lot of it is going to happen through school-based discussion, school cluster discussion, and I agree with you completely that there has to be a lot of professional development, that needs to take place. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Selan. Can I add just one question to that one? So, would you share with us how, because giving the autonomy to teachers to assess their students requires more competent teachers, more professional ones. So, could you share with us how are actually teachers recruited in Australia, in Singapore? So we heard that teachers recruitment system in Singapore are quite competitive and quite difficult job to get. So if you could share with us, it would be very beneficial.
I think change is happening. I just happened to get this latest publication called Contact, where they document changes that are happening in schools. Of course, in 1997 when it was first launched, it's a systems perspective. Perhaps not many took it that seriously. So step by step, I think the system is growing in confidence. That's why it has come to the point that last year they can actually say, no, remove these examinations. No more mid-year examination. No more weighted assessments. You can go and just focus on the learning. But again, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean you throw reliability out of the window. You still need to have discussion and still need to have exemplars and benchmark scripts. In relation to what you mentioned about teacher ability, I think that is a question that every system has to ask of itself. Maybe at different points of development, as I said, we moved from a very centralized, actually it's not even correct to say we have moved. We are moving from a centralized, very heavily centralized governed system to a more autonomous system, and it's taking us quite a while. It's a long process, and I suppose different education systems have to make the judgment at which point you do that and how best to do it. Because teacher capacity, teacher ability, and I'm sure in a country that is very large and has many different ethnicities and provincial considerations like India or Indonesia, the issues are far more complex as well. Okay, and that is definitely a consideration that we need to take into account for the educational policy makers. Yes.
Thank you. We still have time. if you have any questions. Bu Rasita. 2 more. Okay. 1, 2. Once more. Satu lagi. Ada? Nggak ada? Baik. Bu Rasita, silakan. Please mention your name and your institutional affiliation.
My name is Rasita. I am from Edukasi. My question is for Dr. Selan. When you describe about the changes in Singapore, mostly it's about on the technical considerations of on educations. Could you elaborate also the socio and political context that drive that such big changes in Singapore? We want to learn from that. And secondly, my question is for Professor Yamada. Is it after the results showing that there is a consistency between the perceptions on the ability of the students and the result of their test, is there any recommendations that coming out from that study? And what are the actual actions coming out from that study? Thank you.
Thank you. Ibu, silakan.
Thank you. My name is Ririn. My question is for Professor Reiko Yamada. I'm interested in your research related to Japanese context in terms of developing critical thinking and problem solving. Maybe more like how the transition from secondary education to higher education, how they prepare it, because it's like a long-term process to develop it. And maybe it's a bit like zoom out from your the background of your study. That's the first question. And the second is from your experience, you mentioned in the last slide about future challenge. To do comparative research in both Asia and other countries. I'm interested in the cultural aspect, maybe like the compatibility and incompatibility among different cultures. How do you consider and how you take it into account in your research? Thank you.
Thank you. Another one? No? Okay. Please, Dr. Selan, to respond to the question.
Actually, thank you very much for the question. I think that is a very fundamental question. So why move this way? Okay, move in this direction. Now, I think it's no secret that Singapore is a small country, okay, and we have very few natural resources, okay, and we always say that people are our most important resource, our own resource. Okay, so I think the big changes that are happening, that are affecting Indonesia, all the countries of the world, Singapore, advances in IT, globalization, okay, they are already making a huge impact on the socio-economic dimensions of society, because it is not a very predictable future anymore, okay? And the idea of having one job for a lifetime is fast disappearing. Many jobs, many kinds of jobs are disappearing. So the main impetus to answer directly the question is that the government recognizes that we need to prepare our students for an uncertain future, less predictable future, okay? And in order to do this, we need to cultivate the 21st century competencies, things like higher order thinking, communication skills, creative skills, collaborative skills, So again, it's looking at the end in mind, looking further ahead. Actually, it's already happening, but it's going to happen at a faster rate. So it's really, those are the socio-economic contexts in which this whole changes are happening.
Thank you very much for your questions. First one is the recommendation to recommendation based on our research result is that in Japan so far most of the educational administration or of the government emphasize the kind of the level of the secondary schooling and primary schoolings. And it is controlled by the national entrance examination at the time of the admission to the universities. But now, if we focus on the rate of going to the 4 years college, it increased to 57%. And if we include technical schools, it is more than 75%. That means the massification of higher education. So we cannot control any kind of the level of the student at the time of the admissions. Then what happens, as he explained, the 21st century competence. The 21st century competence is required for all the students in the level from the secondary school to the higher education level worldwide. Then compared with the secondary schooling or primary schooling, Japanese higher education system does not have not emphasized the measuring the learning outcomes of the student at the time of the graduation. But now we have to think about to measure the learning outcome as the diploma policy. Then, so far, we developed a kind of indirect assessment. It is a self-reported assessment, how student can improve their competences or disciplinary knowledge at the time of compared with the time of the admission to the graduation level. But it is not enough. So now, most of the universities are required to develop the kind of measuring the learning outcome at the time of the graduation. They use some of the standardized tests like the TOEFL or TOEIC or something like that for English languages. But now, we think that and many faculties do not believe that level of the, do not review the responses of indirect assessment. But we say that the students' answers are reliable or correlated with the direct assessments. So we invented the two sets of integration of direct and indirect assessment. And so in Indonesia, I don't know the situation is about the government wanted to measure the learning outcome of university graduates. But in the future, I think many countries like Indonesia or East Asian countries are required to measure the learning outcomes of the undergraduate students. So probably our project, our research project is one of the kind of example for your countries. And also the second question is how to transit from the secondary school. In Japan right now, to get or to gain the 21st century competences are required for all the level of the schooling, from primary to secondary and higher education. So to be the independent learner, to be the active learner, the teaching style of the teachers at the primary schooling and secondary schooling is deformed right now. More from the knowledge-based banking style to the more active teaching or active learners. So it is a kind of the transition from the high school to the universities. So at now, the small percentage of students who experience to be the independent learner or active learner is not so high. But in the 2 or 3 years, I hope and we expect more students with the experience of the active learning at the high school will come to the university and to have the experience of develop the critical thinking and the creative thinking, especially for STEM fields. That is very important because STEM is a kind of strength of Japanese universities, but more banking style, so to be more active learning style for the STEM field. And comparability in other Asian countries, like the China or Korea, South Korea, East Asian countries, cultures are very similar. So they are now forced to reform such kind of knowledge-based teaching and learning to be more independent learners and more active learners. So the comparative studies or comparative analysis becomes very important.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamada. Actually, we still have like 5 minutes left. If anyone has any question, just one question maybe. But if not, I think we have to conclude the discussion. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you very much for your participation today. So we have learned from the speakers today at least 3 examples of innovative assessment. First of all, we learned from Australia how to develop constructed response item to assess the complex learning process. And secondly, we learned from Japan how to reduce the standardized testing by empowering teachers to assess their children in schools, in the classrooms. And the last one, we also we learned from Singapore, I'm sorry, to how to empower our teachers to assess their students in their classrooms. And then lastly, we also learned from Japan how to use direct and indirect assessment to grab the whole picture of students' competence, not only in terms of toward degree, but also in terms of why they attend to such degree. So, please join me to thank our wonderful speakers today by giving a big applause. And I hope you enjoy the presentation today. And thank you also for your active participation. And I won't summarize or conclude the discussion. I will give it as your homework to do it, to draw the conclusion and the summary. And I will give back the time to the organizer, so to explain what's next after this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bapak Irsad, for conducting our discussion. To our distinguished speakers, kindly remain on the stage for receiving the souvenirs. And cordially invited to the stage Bapak Sidik Pranyoto, Ibu Lilis Windiarti, and Pak Bagus Hari Prakorso, representative of Head of National Assessment Center, to pass on the souvenir to our distinguished speakers.
silakan. Sehat Ibu, sehat.
Thank you very much and kindly be seated. Participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to having break and enjoy our lunch this afternoon. Before we proceed to our parallel discussion, please enjoy the lunch for about 1 hour and waiting you back in this room at 12:45. Okay, now let me inform you that our lunch is already reserved in the foyer out of this room. Okay, thank you participants and all the participants, thank you and enjoy the lunch. And we're waiting you back in this room at 12:45. Thank you. Good afternoon.